In 1942, deep inside a dimly lit office in Berlin, a classified report landed on a desk. The numbers were impossible. American tank production figures, tens of thousands of units per year, defied every calculation, every estimate, every known industrial capacity. German intelligence officers studied the data with growing disbelief. The United States, they had been told, was soft, unprepared, industrially inferior to the Reich's precision manufacturing. But evidence from the battlefields told a different story. Tanks poured endlessly from American lines. Shermans, Grants, tank destroyers, far beyond what any known factory could produce. The German High Command demanded answers. Where were these factories? How could a nation an ocean away be outproducing the industrial heart of Europe? Determined to uncover the truth, the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, sent spies across oceans and borders to trace America's industrial heartbeat. They searched for massive complexes, for smoke-belching giants that surely must exist somewhere in the American Midwest. What they found hidden in plain sight, beneath warehouses, inside schools, across farmland, would shock them to the core and reveal one of the greatest secrets of the Second World War. January 1942. America has been at war for barely a month. In Berlin, the mood is cautiously optimistic. Yes, the Americans have entered the conflict, but Germany's intelligence apparatus believes the industrial giant is asleep, unprepared, years away from meaningful production. The Blitzkrieg has conquered most of Europe. The Wehrmacht is the most powerful military machine on earth. American entry into the war is seen as more symbolic than strategic. But within weeks, something begins to trouble the analysts at Abwehr headquarters. Reports filtering through neutral channels, Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, carry disturbing figures. American military production targets that seem absurd. Tank production alone, projected at 50,000 units for 1943. 50,000. The number appears in dispatch after dispatch, consistent enough to demand attention. German production, by comparison, would struggle to reach 15,000 in the same time frame. The numbers are dismissed as propaganda, American bluster, psychological warfare designed to intimidate the Axis powers. After all, Germany's intelligence network knows where the major industrial centers are: Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland. They've mapped them, analyzed their capacity, estimated their output. The math doesn't support these wild claims. But then come the battlefield reports. North Africa. Sherman tanks appearing in quantities that don't match the projections. Not dozens, hundreds, then thousands. Lend-lease shipments to the Soviets containing armor that shouldn't exist yet, according to German production timelines. The mission admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, convenes a special intelligence unit. Their mission is specific and urgent: locate America's hidden tank factories. The assumption is logical. Such massive production requires massive facilities. Somewhere in the American heartland, there must be complexes the size of entire cities, industrial fortresses churning out war machines day and night. They must be camouflaged, hidden beneath nets or underground, protected from aerial reconnaissance and prying eyes. German agents are dispatched through elaborate networks. Some travel via South America, using the German expatriate communities in Argentina and Brazil as cover. Others move through Mexico, where Axis sympathies still linger in certain circles. A few operate from within the United States itself, embedded years before the war began. Their orders are clear: photograph everything, document rail lines, track freight movements, identify power consumption patterns, find the factories. The hunt begins with confidence. German intelligence has cracked the industrial secrets of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. America, with its open society and free press, should be even easier. They would soon discover how wrong they were. The invisible enemy. The first reports return within months, and they make no sense. Agents in Detroit photograph the obvious targets: the River Rouge complex, Chrysler's main plants, the vast General Motors facilities. Yes, these are expanding. Yes, they're transitioning to war production. But the scale doesn't match the numbers, not even close. One agent, operating undercover as a Canadian businessman, manages to tour a Chrysler facility. His report is meticulous. Assembly lines, production schedules, visible capacity. His conclusion, facility capable of producing approximately 800 to 1,000 units monthly. Insufficient to meet reported targets. But here's what he missed, and what every German agent would continue to miss. He was looking at one factory. What he couldn't see was that Chrysler wasn't just one factory anymore. It was an organism, a distributed network of production that had transformed dozens of facilities across Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio into a single invisible manufacturing entity. Transmissions came from one plant, engines from another, armor plate from a third. Final assembly happened at the Detroit Arsenal, but the arsenal itself was fed by a web of suppliers so vast and so dispersed that no single observer could map it. The spies were searching for a dragon. What they needed to find was a swarm. The pattern that wasn't there. By late 1942, frustration mounts in Berlin. Intelligence reports contradict production claims, yet physical evidence, captured American equipment, battlefield losses, Lend-Lease shipments, all confirm that the tanks exist. One analyst proposes a theory: underground factories. America's industrial heartland sits on vast limestone caverns. Perhaps the Americans have tunneled into the earth, creating subterranean production facilities immune to bombing. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Germany itself has begun moving critical production underground to escape Allied air raids. The Americans, with years to prepare and vast empty spaces, could have built an entire shadow industry beneath the surface. Resources are diverted to this theory. Geological surveys are studied. Limestone deposits in Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee are flagged as probable sites. Agents are instructed to watch for suspicious trucking activity near cave systems. Nothing is found. Another theory emerges. The factories are mobile, temporary facilities, quickly assembled and disassembled, moving across the country to avoid detection. Rail-mounted production lines, modular assembly plants on wheels. Again, nothing. The truth is simpler and far more revolutionary than anything German intelligence imagines. America hasn't hidden its factories. It's hidden them by not hiding them at all. In May 1940, before America even entered the war, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat that would echo through history. He spoke of making America the great arsenal of democracy, a phrase that sounded noble but vague. What Roosevelt knew, and what few Americans yet understood, was that this wasn't a metaphor. It was a blueprint. The War Production Board, established in early 1942, would execute one of the most ambitious organizational transformations in human history. Its goal wasn't to build new factories, though some would be built, but to reprogram the entire American industrial ecosystem. Every factory, every machine shop, every foundry and forge across the nation. The genius of the American system was decentralization. While Germany concentrated production in massive, purpose-built facilities, efficient but vulnerable, America would disperse it across thousands of smaller sites, creating a network too vast to destroy, too complex to comprehend. The shadow factory. The concept was called shadow factory production, adapted from British experiments, but implemented on an unprecedented American scale. Here's how it worked. A tractor factory in Illinois that had spent decades building farm equipment would receive new specifications. The same workers, the same machines, the same assembly processes, but now producing tank transmissions instead of gearboxes for combines. From the outside, nothing changed. The factory looked identical. The workers came and went on the same shifts. The only difference was what rolled out the loading dock. A washing machine plant in Ohio began stamping armor plate. A typewriter manufacturer in New York switched to producing tank periscopes. A company that made cash registers started building gun sights. Each facility was small, unremarkable, invisible to aerial reconnaissance because they looked exactly like what they had always been. Civilian factories doing civilian work. But together they became something unprecedented. The Germans were looking for the Death Star. America had built the Borg. Detroit Arsenal, hidden in plain sight. In June 1940, construction began on what would become the largest tank production facility on Earth, the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant. Chrysler Corporation, which had never built a military vehicle, was tasked with creating a facility capable of producing 1,500 medium tanks per month. The Army wanted it built in 18 months, an impossible timeline by conventional standards. It opened in 10 months. But here's the crucial detail. The Detroit Arsenal wasn't hidden. It was enormous. Over 1.2 million square feet under one roof, with rail lines, power stations, and a workforce that would eventually exceed 10,000 people. From above, it was clearly visible. German intelligence photographed it, analyzed it, calculated its capacity, and got it wrong. Because what they couldn't see was that the Detroit Arsenal was only the final assembly point. The actual production happened everywhere else. Engines came from a Chrysler plant in Detroit that had previously made car engines. Transmissions arrived from a Continental Motors facility in Michigan. Armor plate was fabricated at steel mills in Gary, Indiana, and Pittsburgh. Gun mounts were manufactured at a former appliance factory in Wisconsin. Tracks were forged at a locomotive plant in Pennsylvania. Each of these facilities looked like what it was, a small to medium industrial site doing ordinary manufacturing work. German analysts would note them, estimate their capacity, and move on. A single plant producing 200 engines per month wasn't alarming, but 50 such plants all feeding into a single assembly operation? That was invisible magic. The conversion miracle. The speed of conversion was itself a secret weapon. In Germany, retooling a factory for war production was a complex bureaucratic process requiring months of planning, specialized equipment, and government oversight. The German industrial model prized precision and specialization. Each factory designed for specific outputs, each machine calibrated for particular tolerances. American factories were different. They'd been built for flexibility. The American automotive industry had pioneered mass production, yes, but it had also mastered rapid model changes. Every year, new car designs, new tools, new processes. American manufacturers were comfortable with change in a way German engineers weren't. When war came, that cultural difference became strategic advantage. A General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan that built Buick automobiles switched to producing aircraft engine parts in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The same workers retrained, the same floor space reorganized, the same machinery repurposed. Stories like this repeated across the nation. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan went from empty ground to B-24 bomber production in 18 months, eventually rolling out one complete bomber every 63 minutes. The Germans knew about Willow Run. It was too big to hide. What they didn't know was that it represented not an exception, but a pattern. Across America, hundreds of facilities were performing similar transformations, creating a distributed production network that operated like a single, continental-scale factory. The small-town war, but the real secret of American production wasn't in the big cities. It was in the small towns. A machine shop in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, population 63,000, began producing tank turret bearings. The shop employed 43 people. It had always made agricultural equipment components. Now it made precision military hardware, indistinguishable from the civilian parts that had been its trade for decades. A foundry in Lima, Ohio switched from railroad parts to tank bogies, the wheels that supported track systems. Again, nothing visible changed. The building looked the same, the workers looked the same, but the products rolling out were now critical military components. Multiply this by thousands. Every small city, every industrial town, every community with metalworking capability became part of the machine. Component production was so dispersed that even if a German saboteur had managed to destroy a facility, which none did, the impact would have been negligible. Another shop would simply absorb the workload. This decentralization had another advantage. It was self-healing. When a plant experienced production problems, bottlenecks, or equipment failures, the War Production Board could instantly redirect orders to other facilities in the network. If a foundry in Pennsylvania couldn't meet its quota for armor plate, mills in Indiana and Ohio would increase production. The system had redundancy built into every layer. Germany had efficiency. America had resilience. The camouflage of normalcy. Perhaps the most brilliant aspect of this system was how deliberately ordinary it appeared. The War Production Board enforced strict policies about facility appearance. No military markings on civilian buildings. No dramatic expansions that would alter skylines or attract attention. Existing structures were repurposed rather than replaced. Security was tight, but invisible. Workers were told not to discuss production details, but the factories themselves advertised openly. "We're doing our part for the war effort." Signs, posters, public pride. This created a paradox for German intelligence. The factories were hidden because they weren't hiding. An agent photographing industrial districts in Detroit or Cleveland would see exactly what was there. Automobile plants, steel mills, machine shops, all operating normally. What he couldn't see was that normally now meant something different. The cars were tanks. The normal was warfare. Intelligence analysis depends on finding anomalies. When everything is an anomaly, nothing appears unusual. The labor force. And then there were the workers themselves, another invisible element of American production. Germany's war industry depended heavily on forced labor, concentration camp prisoners, and conscripted workers from occupied territories. This created obvious signatures: barbed wire, guard towers, security protocols that screamed military facility. American war factories employed volunteers, citizens, workers who lived in nearby neighborhoods, who walked or took streetcars to their shifts, who looked exactly like civilian workers because they were civilian workers. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, she was camouflage. Women constituted 40% of the workforce in many war plants. They worked alongside men of every age, background, and skill level. From the outside, these facilities looked diverse, civilian, normal. German agents observing shift changes would see crowds that resembled any industrial workforce, not a militarized production complex. The secrecy was social, not physical. Everyone knew they were building tanks, planes, and shells, but they also knew not to talk about it. The security wasn't walls and guns. It was culture and commitment. By mid-1943, over 12 million Americans worked in war industries. 12 million people, spread across every state, every city, every town with manufacturing capability. It wasn't a hidden factory. It was a hidden nation, forged into a single purpose. The pattern emerges. It began with the railroads. In late 1942, a German agent operating in Mexico managed to cultivate a contact within the American railroad industry. A freight dispatcher, bitter about wartime wage controls. The man wasn't a traitor exactly. He simply talked too much after a few drinks about how the war had transformed rail traffic. What he described didn't sound like military movement. It sounded like chaos. Steel plate shipments from Pittsburgh to destinations across the Midwest, engine blocks moving from Detroit to Ohio, machine parts traveling from Wisconsin to Michigan, nothing moving directly from manufacturer to military base. Instead, everything circulating through a web of intermediate facilities. The agent's report reached Berlin in January 1943. An analyst named Klaus Reinhardt, a mathematician by training, began mapping the rail movements. At first it looked random, but Reinhardt was good at finding patterns in noise. He plotted every documented shipment on a map of the United States, using colored pins for different types of cargo. Steel here, engines there, armor plate, transmissions, gun mounts, artillery pieces. Each pin represented a facility, each line a connection. What emerged was breathtaking. Not a few large factories, not even dozens, but hundreds of facilities, all interconnected, feeding into assembly points that in turn supplied military depots. The network had no center, no single critical node. It was distributed, redundant, organic. Reinhardt titled his report, "Analysis of Decentralized American War Production, A New Paradigm." His superiors initially dismissed it. Too complex, too unconventional, too American, but the evidence kept accumulating. Freight volumes don't lie. Other pieces fell into place. German naval intelligence, tracking Allied shipping through U-boat reports, noted something strange. The volume of military equipment leaving American ports exceeded the known capacity of identified factories by a factor of 3. Either American factories were impossibly efficient, which seemed unlikely, or there were far more factories than German intelligence had identified. Air reconnaissance photographs from high-altitude flights by converted commercial aircraft showed industrial districts across the American Midwest. Analysts counted smokestacks, measured building footprints, estimated power consumption based on electrical infrastructure. The numbers didn't add up. A typical German tank factory, say the MAN works in Augsburg, produced about 200 tanks per month from a massive dedicated facility. By German calculations, America should need 40 such facilities to meet reported production targets. But there weren't 40 massive tank plants. There were maybe 5 truly large facilities: Detroit Arsenal, Lima, and a handful of others. So where were the tanks coming from? A junior analyst named Hermann Volker proposed what seemed like a radical idea. What if the Americans weren't building tank factories? What if they were building tanks in factories that already existed? It was a subtle but crucial distinction. The dummy factory revelation. In spring 1943, German intelligence received what appeared to be a breakthrough: photographs of a massive industrial complex under construction in rural Indiana, complete with rail connections, power lines, and what looked like foundry operations. Bomber crews were briefed. If America ever came within range, this facility was a priority target. But a follow-up reconnaissance mission 6 months later showed something odd. The facility appeared abandoned. Construction had stopped. No smoke from chimneys, no activity. Eventually, through sources in neutral Sweden, the truth emerged. It was a decoy, a dummy factory built with minimal actual infrastructure designed to attract exactly the attention it received. And it wasn't alone. The United States had constructed dozens of fake military installations, airfields with wooden planes, supply depots filled with empty crates, and yes, factory complexes that existed only to waste German intelligence resources. The realization was profound and unsettling. If the Americans were sophisticated enough to build elaborate decoys, how much of Germany's intelligence picture was fiction? More importantly, what were the decoys hiding? Counterintelligence strikes. Unknown to the Abwehr, the FBI had been conducting its own operation since 1941. The Duquesne spy ring investigation had rolled up 33 German agents in the largest espionage bust in American history. But the FBI hadn't stopped there. They'd flipped several agents, turning them into double agents, feeding carefully crafted misinformation back to Berlin. Reports of production difficulties that didn't exist, inflated accounts of labor strikes, descriptions of factories in the wrong locations with the wrong capabilities. The American counterintelligence apparatus was poisoning German understanding of U.S. production capacity. One turned agent, codenamed Peasant, sent regular reports describing bottlenecks in steel production, labor shortages, and quality control problems, all fabricated. His handlers in Berlin believed him because his information came with just enough verifiable truth to seem credible. Meanwhile, actual production accelerated beyond even American projections. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, the Lima Locomotive Works, a company that had built railroad engines since 1869, switched to tank production in 1942. German intelligence knew about Lima. It appeared on their target lists. But their analysis categorized it as a minor production facility based on its size and location. Railroad locomotives weren't tanks after all. The conversion would be complex, limited, slow. They were wrong on every count. Lima, with its expertise in building heavy machinery and working with large steel components, proved to be brilliantly suited for tank production. The M4 Sherman tanks that rolled out of Lima were identical to those from Detroit Arsenal. But they came from a facility German intelligence had rated as low priority. By 1943, Lima was producing hundreds of tanks per month. More importantly, Lima represented a pattern German intelligence had failed to recognize. American industrial facilities weren't specialized. They were adaptable. A company that built locomotives had the tools, the workforce, and the expertise to build tanks. A company that made tractors could build artillery pieces. A company that made refrigerators could manufacture aircraft components. This flexibility was invisible to German analysts, trained in a system where specialization was sacred. In the German industrial model, a tank factory built tanks because it had been designed from the ground up to build tanks. The idea that a locomotive factory could simply switch violated their assumptions about how manufacturing worked. But American industry had been built differently, on different principles, with different cultural values. Adaptability over specialization, speed over precision, volume over perfection. These weren't flaws, they were features. The intelligence breakdown. By mid-1943, the Abwehr's reports on American production had become a bureaucratic nightmare. Different agents sent conflicting information. Facility counts varied wildly. Production estimates ranged from pessimistically low to absurdly high. The railroad dispatcher's data suggested a network too complex to be real. The decoy factories undermined confidence in photographic intelligence. The turned agents fed poison data. Klaus Reinhardt, the analyst who'd mapped the production network, submitted a final comprehensive report in August 1943. It ran to 187 pages and included detailed maps, production estimates, and strategic analysis. His conclusion was stark. The United States has not hidden its war factories. It has transformed its entire industrial economy into a war factory. Every facility, every machine shop, every metalworking operation is part of a unified production system. This system cannot be effectively bombed because it has no center. It cannot be sabotaged because it has too many redundant nodes. It cannot be disrupted because it is self-healing. American production capacity exceeds our estimates by a minimum factor of 2, and possibly by a factor of 4 or more. The report was classified secret as command level only and circulated among senior Abwehr officials and Wehrmacht leadership. Some dismissed it as defeatism, others found it technically implausible, but a few, including Admiral Canaris himself, recognized the truth in Reinhardt's analysis. The industrial war was already lost. The numbers speak. By the end of 1943, hard data confirmed what intelligence had struggled to believe. American tank production, 29,497 units for the year. German tank production, 10,700 units for the year. Nearly 3 to 1. And that didn't include the tens of thousands of other armored vehicles, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and specialized variants pouring out of American factories. The Sherman tank, derided by some as inferior to German designs like the Tiger or Panther, had a secret advantage that no amount of armor or firepower could match. There were so many of them. For every Tiger tank Germany fielded, America produced 30 Shermans. The math was brutal and inescapable. Quality, the German military had always believed, would triumph over quantity. This assumption had driven German industrial strategy, military doctrine, and tactical thinking. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The spy who understood among the Abwehr agents who'd been tracking American production was a man named Richard, operating under deep cover in New York City since 1938. Richard wasn't his real name. That remains classified even today. But his story represents the moment German intelligence truly comprehended what they faced. Richard was educated, meticulous, and careful. He'd spent years building a cover identity as an import-export broker, cultivating contacts, establishing legitimacy. When war came, he began gathering industrial intelligence with patience and precision. By late 1943, he'd assembled information from dozens of sources: labor union members, factory workers, truck drivers, newspaper reports, public filings, and his own observations. He synthesized it into a single assessment, encrypted it carefully, and sent it through the chain of contacts that would eventually carry it to Berlin. The message was intercepted by American counterintelligence and decrypted after the war. It read in part, "Production estimates must be revised upward by minimum 300%. Previous analysis fundamentally flawed. American system not comparable to European industrial models. Entire civilian economy has militarized without visible military infrastructure. Recommend immediate strategic reassessment of production capacity and war duration projections. Richard was arrested 3 months later in an FBI sweep, tried for espionage, and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His report reached Berlin too late to matter, but it confirmed what the Abwehr had been reluctantly concluding for months. America's hidden factories had never been hidden. They'd been hiding in plain sight, invisible because they looked exactly like what they'd always been. The ordinary heart of an extraordinary nation. AT4, the turning point, 35 minutes to 45 minutes. The memo that changed nothing. In November 1943, a secret memorandum circulated through German military intelligence circles. Classified most secret, destroy after reading, copies were distributed to senior Wehrmacht officers, Luftwaffe commanders, and Kriegsmarine leadership. The memo, authored by the Abwehr's Industrial Intelligence Division, was blunt. Strategic bombing of American production facilities is not feasible. The facilities are too numerous, too dispersed, and too deeply integrated into civilian infrastructure. Even total destruction of the top 10 identified facilities would reduce American output by less than 15%. Naval blockade is equally ineffective given American domestic resource availability. The United States industrial advantage is insurmountable through military means. The memo concluded with a recommendation that was never seriously considered. Seek negotiated peace before American production completely overwhelms Axis capability. Most officers who read it found it defeatist. Some questioned the analysis. A few, notably several senior Luftwaffe officers, understood its implications immediately. Germany had lost the industrial war before the shooting war was even half over. Hitler, when briefed on these assessments, dismissed them. In his mind, German production was sufficient. German technology was superior. German will would prevail. The numbers showing American production at 2, 3, 4 times German output, propaganda, exaggeration, Allied psychological warfare. He refused to believe his own intelligence services. The arsenal unleashed. While German leadership debated reports they didn't want to believe, American factories hit their stride. 1944 would prove to be the peak of American war production, a year when the decentralized system Reinhardt had identified operated at maximum efficiency. Tank production, 17,565 medium tanks alone, plus thousands of light tanks, tank destroyers, and specialized variants. Aircraft production, over 96,000 aircraft of all types. Ships, hundreds of Liberty ships, dozens of aircraft carriers, countless smaller vessels. Artillery pieces, trucks, jeeps, ammunition. The volumes were staggering. But more than the raw numbers, what mattered was the logistical miracle that supported them. The Red Ball Express. The famous Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy operation that supplied Allied forces after D-Day, perfectly illustrated what American production had achieved. At its peak, 6,000 trucks operated on the Red Ball Express routes, moving 12,500 tons of supplies per day. These weren't just American trucks driving on European roads. They were American trucks, built in American factories, shipped across American-built ships, fueled by American oil refined in American facilities, maintained with American spare parts that flowed through American supply chains. The entire operation would have been impossible without the production network that German spies had searched for and failed to comprehend. Every truck came from somewhere. Every spare part had been manufactured. Every gallon of fuel refined, every tire molded, every bolt threaded. The logistics of the Red Ball Express stretched back across the Atlantic to thousands of facilities across America, each one contributing something to the whole. German forces in France faced not just an army, but an entire economy mobilized and projected across an ocean. The human element. But statistics alone don't capture what made American production revolutionary. The human story, and deliberately downplayed during the war for security reasons, revealed the true secret. Consider the Detroit Arsenal tank plant at peak production. The facility operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 3 shifts, over 10,000 workers. And these workers were unlike anything German intelligence had expected. Women comprised nearly 40% of the workforce. Many had never worked in manufacturing before. They were teachers, homemakers, secretaries, students, civilians who learned precision machining, welding, electrical work, and assembly operations in weeks. African Americans, often denied opportunities in peacetime industry, found meaningful work and fair wages in war production. The urgent need for labor helped break down some, though certainly not all, of the racial barriers that had constrained American industry. Elderly workers considered beyond retirement age contributed expertise and training. Teenagers worked part-time shifts after school. Disabled workers found roles suited to their abilities. This wasn't slave labor. It wasn't forced conscription. It was voluntary participation on a national scale, driven by a shared sense of purpose that German intelligence reports consistently underestimated. The morale factor mattered more than efficiency studies could measure. The comparison. Let's be precise about what American decentralization achieved versus German centralization. Germany's production model was built around massive, purpose-designed facilities. The Krupp works in Essen, the Daimler-Benz plants, the MAN facilities. These were engineering marvels, efficient, organized, producing high-quality equipment. But they were also targets. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified, German production became increasingly disrupted. A single successful raid on a critical facility could reduce output for months. Rebuilding required time, resources, and workers that were increasingly scarce. America's decentralized network had no such vulnerability. When a tornado struck a components facility in Kansas in 1944, destroying a plant that made tank turret traversing mechanisms, production didn't stop. Orders were redistributed to facilities in Wisconsin and Ohio. Within 2 weeks, output had returned to normal levels. The plant in Kansas was rebuilt, but the war effort never noticed its absence. This wasn't planned redundancy in the modern sense. It was organic resilience, the natural result of having hundreds of facilities capable of performing similar work. The technological gap. Here's where German assumptions about quality versus quantity became tragic. Yes, German tanks like the Tiger II were technically superior in many measures. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optics. But they were also mechanical nightmares, complex, difficult to maintain, prone to breakdown, and worst of all, slow to produce. Germany produced 492 Tiger II tanks during the entire war. America produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. 100 Shermans for every Tiger II. The math was brutal. Even if one Tiger II could destroy 5 Shermans before being disabled, which was optimistic, the Americans could afford the exchange. They had 95 Shermans left. Germany had no replacement Tigers. This wasn't about engineering excellence. It was about industrial philosophy. German tanks were designed to be perfect. American tanks were designed to be good enough, in overwhelming numbers, with the logistical support to keep them running. The Sherman wasn't the best tank in the war. It was the most successful tank in the war, and the distinction mattered more than pride. The intelligence collapse. By 1944, the Abwehr's American operations had largely collapsed. The FBI, working with military intelligence, had identified and neutralized most German agents operating in the United States. The few who remained were either under surveillance or had been turned into double agents. German intelligence's picture of American production was now almost entirely composed of misinformation fed by Allied counterintelligence or derived from analysis of publicly available information, newspapers, industry publications, radio broadcasts, which was accurate but lacked the context to be strategically useful. Ironically, some of the most accurate information about American production came from American sources themselves. Newspapers celebrated factory outputs, radio programs praised war workers, government officials publicly announced production milestones. But without the ground-level intelligence to contextualize these reports, German analysts couldn't distinguish propaganda from reality. The true figures sounded so absurd that they were dismissed as exaggeration, while the planted false information seemed plausible. The intelligence war had become a mirror game where truth looked like lies and lies were believed as truth. The hidden workers, what German intelligence never fully grasped, because it was invisible to espionage, was the cultural dimension of American production. In Germany, war production was organized through state control, strict hierarchies, and in many cases, forced labor. Workers did their jobs because they were ordered to, paid to, or compelled to. In American factories, something different was happening. Workers competed with each other to exceed production quotas. Facilities hung banners celebrating output milestones. Employees bought war bonds with their wages, directly investing in the conflict they were supporting through their labor. Newspapers published stories about victory shifts where production exceeded targets. This wasn't propaganda imposed from above, though propaganda certainly reinforced it. It was genuine, grassroots engagement with the war effort. A Detroit arsenal worker named Rose Monroe, one of thousands who inspired the Rosie the Riveter icon, worked riveting machine gun turret mounts. She was filmed for promotional materials, became modestly famous, and continued working at the plant throughout the war, not because she had to, but because she believed it mattered. Multiply her story by millions. That psychological dimension, the voluntary commitment of an entire population to industrial mobilization, was something German intelligence could observe, but never really quantify. How do you measure morale? How do you calculate the production value of workers who take pride in their output? You can't. But the impact shows up in the statistics. Lower defect rates, higher productivity, greater innovation, and a resilience that couldn't be broken by propaganda or calculated by spreadsheets. The turning point. If there was a single moment when the industrial balance of the war became undeniably clear, it was D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied forces landed on Normandy beaches with an armada that represented the culmination of years of American and British production. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. German defenders, looking at the scale of the invasion, understood immediately what their intelligence services had been reporting for months. This wasn't an army crossing the channel. It was an industrial civilization projecting its power. Within weeks, Allied forces were ashore in France. Within months, they were pushing toward Germany. And behind every advance was a supply chain that stretched back to those hidden in plain sight factories across America. The secret factories had already won the war. The rest was just playing it out. ACT Forum, the legacy, 45 minutes to 50 minutes after the guns fell silent. When the war ended in 1945, something remarkable happened to America's hidden factory network. It vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant completed its final M26 Pershing tank in November 1945. Production lines that had operated continuously for over 3 years ground to a halt. Workers who had spent the war years building instruments of destruction returned to civilian life. But the facilities didn't disappear. They transformed again. Chrysler's tank plants went back to building automobiles. The washing machine factories that had stamped armor plate returned to making appliances. The small-town machine shops that had produced precision military components resumed manufacturing agricultural equipment, industrial tools, and consumer goods. Within 2 years, much of America's war production capacity had reconverted to peacetime use, leaving barely a trace of the massive military-industrial complex that had operated during the war. To an outside observer, or a German intelligence analyst studying post-war America, it would have seemed like magic. Where did the war factories go? The answer, of course, was that they'd never really existed as separate entities. They'd always been American industry, temporarily reprogrammed for a different purpose. The German perspective after the war, when archives were opened and intelligence officers debriefed, the full scope of German misunderstanding became clear. Former Abwehr officers, interviewed by Allied intelligence, expressed a mixture of professional respect and genuine bewilderment. How had they missed it? How had their sophisticated intelligence apparatus, which had successfully penetrated Soviet, British, and French military secrets, failed so completely to comprehend American production? One former analyst speaking in 1946 put it bluntly: "We were looking for what we would have built. We expected centralization, specialization, purpose-built facilities. The American system was so different from our conceptual framework that we couldn't see it even when we were looking directly at it." Klaus Reinhardt, the mathematician who had mapped the production network, survived the war and emigrated to the United States in 1952. He worked for several years as an industrial consultant and eventually taught operations research at MIT. In a 1967 lecture, he reflected on his wartime analysis. The American production system represented a different philosophy of manufacturing, one based on flexibility rather than optimization, on redundancy rather than efficiency, on distributed networks rather than centralized control. In many ways, it was ahead of its time. What we call supply chain management today, the Americans were practicing instinctively in 1942. The real secret historians and analysts have spent decades studying America's wartime production miracle. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, museums built. But the real secret of America's hidden factories was never about geography, camouflage, or even organizational genius. It was about people. The production numbers tell one story: 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2,700 ships, billions of rounds of ammunition. These are impressive statistics, the kind that win wars and reshape history. But behind every number was a person: a welder who learned her trade in 3 weeks, a machinist who worked double shifts, a truck driver who moved components across state lines, an engineer who solved production bottlenecks, a manager who coordinated hundreds of suppliers, a secretary who kept the paperwork flowing. Millions of individuals, each contributing something small, creating something vast. German intelligence searched for hidden factories because they thought in terms of places, buildings, machines. What they needed to search for was commitment, creativity, and collaboration. Intangible assets that don't show up in reconnaissance photographs or manifests. The factories weren't hidden in caves or disguised behind false fronts. They were hidden inside the daily lives of ordinary Americans who became extraordinary contributors to a shared cause. The invisible monument. Today, if you drive through the industrial Midwest, through Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, you'll pass buildings that once housed the secret arsenal of democracy. Most have no plaques, no markers, no historical recognition. They're warehouses now, or light manufacturing facilities, or they've been torn down and replaced with shopping centers and parking lots. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant still exists, repurposed for military vehicle storage and refurbishment. A small museum on the grounds tells the story, but few visitors come. The massive assembly halls where thousands once worked now stand mostly empty. Lima's tank plant continued production through subsequent wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars. Modern M1 Abrams tanks are still built there, though the facility is a shadow of its wartime scale. Most of the smaller facilities, the machine shops, the foundries, the component manufacturers that form the real backbone of production, have left no trace at all. Their contribution exists only in archives, in fading photographs, in the memories of workers now gone. There is no central monument to America's hidden factories, no grand memorial, no national museum. Perhaps that's fitting. The factories were never meant to be visible. Their power came from being overlooked, underestimated, invisible. The lesson. What can we learn from this story 8 decades later? The German spies who searched for hidden factories were looking for traditional power. Concentrated, visible, impressive. They understood industrial might in terms of massive facilities, specialized equipment, hierarchical control. They missed the revolution happening in front of them: distributed networks, flexible manufacturing, rapid adaptation, and the power of voluntary cooperation at scale. These concepts would eventually transform global manufacturing, the just-in-time production systems that emerged in the post-war era, the distributed supply chains that define modern industry. the flexible manufacturing that allows facilities to pivot quickly between product lines. All of these modern innovations have roots in the system America developed during World War II, when necessity demanded industrial transformation at unprecedented speed. But there's a deeper lesson, one that transcends manufacturing strategy. The true hidden factory was never a place, it was a people. When a nation of individuals commits voluntarily to a shared purpose, when teachers become riveters, when farmers become tank builders, when ordinary towns become extraordinary contributors, the productive capacity isn't just additive, it's multiplicative. German intelligence calculated American production capacity by adding up factories. They should have been multiplying by commitment. The final report. In 1947, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey published its analysis of American wartime production. Buried in the appendices was a section analyzing Axis intelligence failures. One passage stands out. Enemy intelligence services consistently underestimated American production capacity by factors ranging from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1, depending on the specific product category. This failure stemmed not from lack of effort or competence, but from fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial organization. The dispersed, decentralized, and flexible nature of American manufacturing created an intelligence picture that appeared fragmented and incomplete because it was designed to be exactly that. The report concluded with an observation that sounds almost philosophical. The search for hidden factories was doomed from the start because the searchers were looking for secrets in the wrong place. The secret was not where production occurred, but how an entire nation could transform itself into a production system. This transformation was visible in every town and city across America, yet invisible to those who didn't understand what they were seeing. The workers remember. In the decades after the war, oral historians interviewed thousands of former war production workers. Their stories, preserved in archives and libraries, capture something the statistics never could. A woman named Dorothy Mills, who worked at Willow Run Building B-24 bombers, recalled, "I'd been a school teacher. I'd never touched a rivet gun in my life. 3 weeks of training, and I was building bombers. Real bombers that real pilots would fly into real combat. Every rivet I set, I thought about the boys flying those planes. I wanted them perfect. We all did." A machinist named James Patterson, who spent the war at a small plant in Indiana making tank components, said, "I never saw a finished tank until after the war, in a newsreel. But I knew every transmission that left our shop was going into one. We were just a little factory, 40-some employees, but we were part of something bigger than ourselves. You could feel it. These workers understood something the German spies never could. They weren't working for a factory. They were working for each other, for their country, for something they believed was larger and more important than any individual contribution. That belief, multiplied by millions, was the real secret weapon. In the end, the German spies found what they were searching for, or at least understood what they'd been missing. The reports that reached Berlin in late 1943 and 1944, the analyses that confirmed American production supremacy, the intelligence assessments that recommended strategic reassessment, all of these told the same story. America's hidden factories existed everywhere and nowhere. They were hidden because they were ordinary. They were powerful because they were distributed. They were unstoppable because they were voluntary. The spies had been sent to find buildings. What they discovered was something far more formidable, a nation unified in purpose, an economy transformed by commitment, and a people capable of the extraordinary achievement when called upon. That was the secret that couldn't be photographed, mapped, or sabotaged. That was the arsenal of democracy. As darkness fell over Europe in the spring of 1945, the factories that had built the instruments of liberation began their transformation back to peace. The workers who had forged victory returned to their ordinary lives, carrying with them the extraordinary knowledge that they had changed history. The facilities that had been hidden in plain sight vanished back into the American landscape, indistinguishable once again from the civilian economy that had spawned them. And the German spies who had searched so desperately for secret factories finally understood the truth. The greatest secret of the war wasn't where America built its weapons, It was that America itself had become the weapon. Every town, every factory, every worker contributing to a force that couldn't be calculated, couldn't be countered, and couldn't be stopped. The hidden factories were never truly hidden. They were all around us. They were us,